So before I turn to Westminster Hospital's Haemophilia Centre, this morning when I referred to the table of data which provides information about the numbers of the numbers of cases of HIV associated with particular haemophilia centres, which was INQY 40250. We don't need to put it up, Shamik. I think I said it was provided by UKHCDO. The table itself was not provided by UKHCDO. It was compiled by the inquiry on the basis of the data supplied by UKHCDO. So I just wanted to make that clear. So I'm turn to consider now the Haemophilia Centre at the Westminster Hospital. Professor Humble was the director 1968 to 1979, succeeded by Dr. Barrett, who was director from around 1979 to 1988, and then Dr. Costello took over as director from, we understand, 1989. Dr. Giangrandi, who of course you heard from him in connection with his later work at the Oxford Haemophilia Centre, was a registrar at the Westminster Hospital under Professor Barrett for a period of time, late 1983 to late 1984. And his recollection in terms of the staffing and facilities, as at the autumn of 1983 in Westminster, was that there were 2 consultants, 3 junior doctors, a transfusion laboratory, a small research laboratory, and 2 clinic rooms where outpatients could be treated. That was in terms of a general haematology department, not specifically dedicated to the Haemophilia Centre. It was based at the Westminster Hospital in Dean Ryle Street in London, and it was one of the 13 designated haemophilia centres in the London area as at 1970. Westminster fell within the North West Thames region, so in terms of regional health authority responsibilities, that's Region 5. And in terms of distribution of NHS concentrates, we have seen documents which suggest that as at 1976, 6 bottles of NHS Factor 8 were allocated to Westminster Hospital. But in fact, if we look at CBLA... Per month, sorry, yes. If we look at CBLA 40657, this is one of the meetings of haemophilia directors, associate haemophilia directors, and directors of blood transfusion centres from the regional health authority areas 4, 5 and 6. This meeting is 23rd of September 1977. If we go to page 4, we can see towards the bottom of the page, there's a reference there to Professor Humble. So although Westminster, as I understand it, notionally fell within the North West Thames region, it actually received its allocation from the South London Blood Transfusion Centre. And we can see that from Professor Humble, so 2 entries up from the bottom of the page, Westminster. NHS concentrate was supplied by Dr. Rogers, South London BTC, so Blood Transfusion Centre, and the allocation was satisfactory. No commercial concentrate had been bought. So that's the picture as at September of 1977. In terms of numbers of patients treated at the centre, we don't need to go to the underlying documents, but again, we have a snapshot as at the end of 1969, beginning of 1970, in a letter from Professor Humble to the Department of Health. I'll just give the reference for the benefit of the transcript. It's DHSC 013026_024. We don't need to go to it. But it showed that at that point in time, there were 13 registered patients at the centre. There'd been 14 incidents of hemorrhage for which patients had attended, and there were no patients who had attended for severe bleeding. If then we look at BPLL 308111, please. You'll see this is a survey that was undertaken by Dr. Maycock at BPL in or around November of 1972. And there are pages for a range of different haemophilia centres. For present purposes, the relevant page is page 32. And we can see, this is the letter that was addressed, sorry, if we just look at the very top left-hand corner, to Dr. Humble, Haematology Department, Westminster Hospital. The letter's headed Factor VIII concentrate for treatment of haemophilia, and it says Factor VIII concentrate is supplied as a freeze-dried preparation in bottles containing from 400 to 600 units. At present, the supply is insufficient for all needs. And then Dr. Maycock addressed a number of questions to a range of haemophilia centres which were the recipients of this letter. How many patients with haemophilia do you treat regularly? And we'll see the answer in relation to Westminster, as at the end of 1972 was 3. And then there is a question, would you prefer to use for the treatment of your patients cryoprecipitate, freeze-dried concentrate, or some cryoprecipitate and some freeze-dried concentrate? And you can see that Dr. Humble's preference was for freeze-dried concentrate. He answered yes to question 2B and no to questions 2A and C. And then if we go further down the page, Dr. Maycock was asking for estimates in terms of how many bottles would be needed annually. So that's Dr. Humble's preference as at the end of 1972. In terms then of what the returns show as to the numbers of patients treated, I won't go through all the returns. Broadly speaking, we have the returns from 1976 through to 1986, and we've summarised what they show in our written presentation note. There are perhaps up to 4 patients with haemophilia A treated on an annual basis on average. At a maximum, I think at some years there's 1 or 2 patients treated. Usually 1 patient with haemophilia B, 1 patient with von Willebrand's disease. That's the kind of figures that emerge from the annual returns. If we then look at what the returns show in terms of the products that were used for the treatment of that small cohort of patients, 1976 shows cryoprecipitate being used for the treatment of haemophilia A and NHS factor 9 concentrate for the treatment of haemophilia B, plasma and cryoprecipitate for the treatment of von Willebrand's disease. 1977 shows cryoprecipitate and NHS concentrate being used for the treatment of haemophilia A and NHS factor 9 concentrate for the treatment of haemophilia B. So there are no commercial concentrates in use in 1976 or 1977. The first use of commercial concentrates emerges in 1979 when we see 40,000 units of the immunoconcentrate cryopulin appearing for the first time on the annual return. In 1980, we see, again, usage of cryobulin, but also the ARMA product Factor VIII and the NHS Factor VIII concentrate, all being used for the treatment of patients with haemophilia A. Again, the pattern in relation to the haemophilia B patient is NHS Factor 9 concentrate, and in relation to von Willebrand, it's a mixed picture that emerges from the returns. In that particular year, ARMA product is in fact used to treat the von Willebrand's patient. 1981 shows some cryoprecipitate being used, but also NHS Factor VIII concentrate and the ARMA product. Likewise, 1982, no cryoprecipitate in use, but NHS Factor VIII concentrate and the ARMA Factor VIII concentrate. Again, the volumes for all these returns are relatively small, reflecting the small number of patients. In relation to 1983, again, we see a combination of NHS Factor VIII concentrates and ARMA concentrate being used. In relation to haemophilia A, the fairly usual picture of NHS Factor 9 concentrate being used for the treatment of haemophilia B. So it's a mix of NHS and commercial concentrates in relatively small volumes until 1984. In 1984, 6 haemophilia A patients were treated. The only treatment identified in the annual returns in 1984 is NHS factor VIII concentrate. And that's a similar picture for the patients with von Willebrand's who were treated that year, with some cryoprecipitate and with some NHS factor VIII concentrate. In terms of knowledge of risk of hepatitis or knowledge of risk of HTLV3 AIDS on the part of the clinicians at Westminster, there's no contemporaneous direct material that the inquiry has. And so, again, it may be a question of drawing inferences from attendance at or receipt of UK HCDO minutes. Professor Humble was not a regular attender at UK HCDO meetings, although the minutes do record his formal apologies on a number of occasions, and it may be a reasonable assumption that he would have received the minutes of the meetings. From time to time, other clinicians attend the meetings on his behalf. And that's true of a number of meetings in the course of the 1970s and the early 1980s, including on occasion Dr. Giangrandi, as you may recall from his oral evidence. But that, I'm afraid, is the limit of the direct evidence that we have, or indeed the indirect evidence we have in relation to developing knowledge of risk. We don't have any information about, amongst this small cohort of patients, the numbers infected with hepatitis C. The data that we received from UK HCDO indicates 1 patient infected with HIV testing positive in 1985. And we don't, I'm afraid, have information about what the arrangements were for testing that small number of patients or how diagnosis test results were communicated to patients or what the arrangements were for their treatment and care. So a relatively limited picture about Westminster, but perhaps unsurprising given the small size of the Haemophilia Centre there. I turn then next to St Mary's Hospital, Paddington. In terms of the directors of the centre, Professor Mollison was director of the centre from 1986 or thereabouts to 1979. He was the lead author of a textbook called Blood Transfusion in Clinical Medicine, and he was a member of a number of committees relating to blood products, blood and transfusions, and we will no doubt come across his name again when our hearings move to consider the role of the blood services.
Just for the sake of the transcript, I think that was 1966, was it?
From around 1968 to 1979.
1968?
Yes.
Yes, because I think you may have said 86.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
So he was then succeeded by Professor Wick Grammersinger and Dr. Dodsworth, who were co-directors of the centre at St Mary's from 1979 and through into the 1980s. We know from material that the inquiry has that Dr. Dodsworth was the member or a member of a working group on trends in the demands for blood products in the course of 1977. In terms of other personnel at St Mary's Hospital more broadly, Dr. Anthony Pinching was an immunologist at St Mary's who was heavily involved in early developments in the course of the 1980s in relation to AIDS, and we've certainly seen his name more generally come up on a number of documents. So not based at the Haemophilia Centre, but a source of information in relation to AIDS potentially at the hospital more generally. St Mary's Haemophilia Centre was based at St Mary's Hospital in Paddington in London. Again, it was one of the 13 designated haemophilia centres in the London area identified and listed in 1970. It was part of the North West Thames region, Region 5, but it received its factor VIII concentrate and no doubt presumably also its cryoprecipitate from the North London Blood Transfusion Centre in Edgware. The allocation as at late 1976 within the North West Thames region of NHS concentrate provided for 15 bottles per month to be made available to St Mary's Hospital. And we have the minutes of a meeting at CBLA 40657. We don't need to turn this up, Seamus, it's really just for the benefit of the transcript. In September 1977, it's one of those meetings of directors of haemophilia centres, associate centres and blood transfusion centres that we've already looked at. It records Dr. Dodsworth at St Mary's saying that they wanted to start 2 patients on home therapy and that they required for that purpose an allocation of NHS concentrate. So that gives us a snapshot of the picture in terms of September 1977. It might suggest that home therapy had not been instituted before that. If we then, again, just in terms of the relatively limited available information we have about St Mary's, turn to DHSC 013026_014. This is a letter of the 23rd of December 1969 from St Mary's Department of Haematology to Dr. Obank at the DHSS. And you'll recall we looked this morning in relation to Great Ormond Street at the text of Dr. Obank's letter asking a number of questions sent out to the various haemophilia centres. And the St Mary's response to that is set out here. It tells us that there were 16 cases registered at the centre. There were 84 incidents of hemorrhage for which patients attended the centre for treatment. That's in the year ending 30th of September 1969. 2 incidents of severe bleeding, no major surgical operations undertaken. And for the benefit of the transcript, that's a response to the letter from Dr. Obank that appears at DHSC 013026_009. So not as small a centre as some of the others that we've looked at, but not a large centre. And if we look at BPLL 000811, again, this is the document we looked at a few minutes ago in relation to Westminster, and we go to page 21 this time. We'll see here Professor Mollison's response on behalf of the Haemophilia Centre at St Mary's in November 1972 to Dr. Maycock's questionnaire. How many patients with haemophilia do you treat regularly? 13. And then in answer to the question about preference for the treatment of patients, he says no to cryoprecipitate, no to a mix of cryoprecipitate and freeze-dried concentrate, and yes to freeze-dried concentrate. So the preference there being expressed was for concentrates, and if we just look further down the page, we can see the estimated usage there set out by Professor Mollison. In terms of the information from the annual returns, we've summarised in the written note what the annual returns show for each year from 1976 through to 1988. Sticking with the period from 1976 to 1986 for present purposes, what they show in terms of the number of patients treated are as follows. Between 5 and 12 patients with haemophilia A, so the figures range depending on the particular year, but that's an indication of the magnitude. Up to 5 haemophilia B patients, and occasionally 1 patient with von Willebrand's treated on an annual basis. We have no direct evidence in relation to treatment policies, again, and so we can look only at the annual returns and what they tell us about blood product usage. 1977, for example, shows cryoprecipitate and NHS concentrate in use. The first commercial concentrate appears to have been used in 1979, and if we just look at that, it's HCDO 301373, please. So we can see this is the return completed for St Mary's by Dr. Dodsworth, 9 patients with haemophilia treated in that year with haemophilia A, I should say 4 patients with haemophilia B. We can see their usage of cryoprecipitate. The estimate is 69,200 units of cryoprecipitate. Use of NHS factor concentrates, just over 40,000. And then we can see some commercial products being used. So a relatively small amount of the ARMA product, factor VIII, just over 7,000 units. And a larger volume of the immuno product, cryobulin, 34,335 units. So that's the beginning of the use of commercial concentrates at St Mary's. There's a similar picture in 1980. I won't take you to that. It shows some use of cryoprecipitate still, usage of NHS factor concentrate, and then use of the ARMA and the immuno products. The 1981 annual return again shows use of cryoprecipitate, NHS factor VIII concentrate, ARMA's factor VIII, and immuno's cryobulin, but the precise figures are too faint to read with any confidence. And again, a similar picture emerging in 1982 in terms of the commercial concentrates used. ARMA's product is used, immuno's is used, NHS factor VIII concentrate is used. No cryoprecipitate appears to be used in that year, except for the treatment of patients with von Willebrand's and for the treatment of a patient with factor VIII antibodies. If then we pick the picture up in relation to 1983, and the reference there is HCDO 301766, please, Shumik. We can see there 7, and then it's crossed out question mark 6 patients treated during the year with haemophilia A, 1 von Willebrand's. And then if we look at the figures, what they appear to indicate for that year is significantly more NHS concentrate used than commercial concentrate. Again, it's not possible because all we have are the returns. Not possible to know the reason for that and whether that reflects a conscious decision on grounds of safety or for some other reason, or whether it's simply reflective of what was made available to the centre.
No, the one that you last showed me with ARMA and immuno and NHS concentrate, they were about 50% each of the total concentrate. This is about 2 to 1.
Yes. And then there's a slight oddity with the annual return for 1984, which is probably easiest to explain by looking at it. So it's HCDO 301860. If we just look at the top of the page, we can see we're talking about St Mary's, 8 haemophilia A patients treated, 1 von Willebrand's patient, and someone's written at the top, it's very difficult to distinguish between inpatient and outpatient use. But if we then look at the figures, they appear to be implausibly high, given the number of patients treated. So they bear no resemblance in terms of volume to figures in previous years. Figure for the use of NHS concentrate, for example, seems to be 1.8 million.
Is that the addition? It's the addition, I think, of the two. If you add 826 and 986, you get an 035 650. You get 1812685. So I think it's just using the.
I think that's right.
The total.
Again, it seems to bear no relationship with the number of patients treated or with the usage in previous years, where I haven't gone through each of the returns, but the magnitude is in the tens of thousands.
But it's staggeringly higher than the commercial.
Yes. So probably not a reliable piece of data, but I wanted to display it on screen so that you could see for yourself what was there set out. As I say, seems implausibly high.
Does it say estimate there?
It does say estimate. And it refers to a letter the 23rd of April 1985, but I don't think we have traced that letter. But in any event, as an estimate, it still wouldn't seem to make sense, because one would have thought if one was going to estimate, one would estimate in part based upon previous usage and conscious of the number of patients likely to be treated in the course of the year, which was always consistently a low number. In any event, it is what it is. The 1985 annual return shows the use only of NHS concentrates, both factor 8 for haemophilia A and factor 9 for haemophilia B. In terms
So in 1985, they managed to get NHS factor 9?
Yes, I'm pretty sure that's right. Let me check. HCDO 401955. So that's haemophilia A. If we go to, and you'll see there only NHS concentrates. If we go over the page. Haemophilia B, 3 patients treated, and you'll see it's home treatment, and it's entirely NHS factor 9 concentrate apparently. Of course, that may mean that it was not heated.
Yes.
In terms then of knowledge of risk, again, our only real guide is attendance at UKHCDO meetings, receipt of UKHCDO minutes. So even prior to becoming director of the centre, Dr. Dodsworth attended meetings on behalf of Professor Mollison on a number of occasions throughout the 1970s. There's no record of Professor Mollison himself attending in person the UKHCDO meetings. And then Dr. Dodsworth attends in her capacity as director, again on a fairly regular basis from 1979 onwards. There is one document with Dr. Mollison that it may be worth looking at on this issue. It's PRSE 301960. These are the minutes of a meeting at the Medical Research Council on the 12th of February 1979. We've looked at the minutes of this meeting for different purposes on an earlier occasion. And we can see that the list of attendees identify there Professor Mollison as being the chair. And then there are a number of other one might say, distinguished attendees. So we've got Dr. Crass, we've got Professor Sherlock, we've got Professor Zuckerman, we've got Sir William Maycock, all in attendance. And we can see from the second paragraph that there is then a discussion initiated by the chair, so initiated by Professor Mollison, about non-A, non-B hepatitis. And again, I won't go through it in detail because, as I say, we've looked at it previously. But for present purposes, if we just go over the page, picking it up in the second line, we see there Professor Zuckerman pointing out that much non-A, non-B associated post-transfusion hepatitis, that's PTH, might be anicteric, and that the risk of progression to chronic liver disease remained, however mild the initial infection. And then it records Professor Sherlock agreeing with Dr. Cleghorn that PTH was rare in the UK, but was nevertheless concerned about the continued use here of blood products of commercial origin. Many of these products were prepared in the United States using blood from professional donors, and they carried a high risk of transmitting non-A, non-B hepatitis. And then the discussion continues. So although Professor Mollison was not a regular attendee at UKHCDO meetings, he was a member of various committees in which issues such as non-A, non-B hepatitis and risks from transfusion were discussed. And we see there one such example. And then just picking matters up with Dr. Dodsworth's later reflections, this is on the question of supply of concentrates more generally. If we go to RLIT 5022, this is a document we've looked at again on a number of occasions in relation to contributions from different clinicians. It was a seminar held at the Wellcome Institute in February 1998, and the topic was Haemophilia, Recent History of Clinical Management. Dr. Dodsworth was one of the participants in the seminar, although she doesn't say an awful lot in comparison with some of the other contributors. We don't have very much, and so it's worth looking at what she does say. If we go first of all to page 39, please. We see there the entry, Dr. Helen Dodsworth. She says, I used to work at St Mary's Hospital, London, after working in Manchester alongside Dr. David Evans. May I say briefly something about the availability of factor VIII concentrate? Although the manufacturing process was discovered in the early 1950s, there was never adequate provision for manufacture of factor VIII concentrate in this country until the early 1970s, and then she refers to the MRC unit on the Elstree site in the early 70s. And then the next paragraph, she says this: in 1976, Pat Mollison, for whom I was working at the time, asked me to represent him on a committee convened to advise the Department of Health on how much factor VIII concentrate and albumin were needed to treat patients in the UK. And that's the Committee on Trends, or the Working Group on Trends in usage of blood products that I referred to a few minutes ago. Our spokesman, Dr. Tovey, the director of the Bristol Transfusion Centre, had been through a similar exercise for the World Health Organization in Geneva. He persuaded us that if we wanted to treat our patients adequately, it would be necessary to fractionate at least 80% of the blood that was donated. At this point, the government decided that money was available for neither extending the fractionation unit at Elstree nor for equipping the transfusion centres to separate yet more plasma from donor units. So this is really why we found ourselves buying large quantities of factor VIII concentrate from America, and why we infected so many of our patients with HIV. And then I won't take you to it, but her second contribution to the seminar is at page 71, and she talks there about there being insufficient plasma for fractionation as a further problem. In terms of numbers of patients treated at St Mary's, the Haemophilia Centre, and infected with HIV, the data the inquiry has received from UK HCDO suggests 3 patients testing positive for HIV, one recorded as in 1984, and that may be an indication of a relatively early testing, or maybe a test on stored sera, we don't know which, and 2 patients in 1985. There are also documents which show Dr. Dodsworth reporting to Miss Spooner at Oxford in 1990 and in 1993 cases of hepatitis. The 1990 case is described as a case of non-B hepatitis in a patient with von Willebrand's disease, who's recorded as having received buckets of cryo plus some factor VIII concentrate. And the 1993 case is described as a case of hepatitis C in one of the patients at the Haemophilia Centre at St Mary's. So that's the available information, again, in a snapshot in relation to the Haemophilia Centre at St Mary's. So I'm going to turn next, sir, to consider University College Hospital, so UCH. So the information that we have in relation to the identity of the directors of the Haemophilia Centre at UCH during the 70s and 80s are Professor Prankard from around 1968 to 1977, and then Dr. Richards from around 1977 to at least 1989. We also have some evidence relevant to UCH from Dr. Paula Bolton-Maggs, who was a registrar at UCH for periods in the 1980s. She describes the facilities in her statement. I won't put the statement up, but let me just read the reference. It's WITN 416001. She describes the facilities at UCH as follows. The haemophilia patients would usually be seen as outpatients in the haematology department. As far as I recall, there was no formal haemophilia centre at UCH. The haematology department at UCH was based in Gower Street in London. And again, UCH was one of those 13 haemophilia centres in the London area designated as such in or by 1970. It formed part of the North East Thames region, so that's Region 6, as identified in various contemporaneous documents. If we look at CBLA 40533, we can see, again, that this is one of the sets of minutes of the meetings of directors of haemophilia centres and blood transfusion centres for the regional health authorities covering regions 4, 5 and 6. Date of this meeting is the 15th of December 1976. If we go to the bottom of the second page, this is in the context of a discussion about allocation and which blood transfusion centre would supply which haemophilia centres with concentrator or NHS concentrates or cryoprecipitate. And if we pick it up towards the bottom of the page, we can see their reference to RHA 6 North East Thames. And it says here, the distribution area of the Brentwood Regional Blood Transfusion Centre, the Brentwood Parish, does not include the whole NET, North East Thames region. There are 3 haemophilia centres and 4 associate centres in RHA 6. Only one of these haemophilia centres, the London Hospital, and all 4 associate centres are in the Brentwood Parish. The RFH, presumably the Royal Free Hospital, and UCH, University College Hospital, are both in the North East Thames Regional Health Authority, but outside the Brentwood Parish. Adjustments need to be made to the allocation of NHS Factor VIII concentrate to Brentwood and Edgware if each director is to supply only his own parish. So you see there, parochial is probably precisely the accurate term, perhaps a parochial attitude on the part of the directors of the regional blood transfusion centres, not wanting to be in a position of having to supply cryoprecipitate, possibly, or certainly NHS concentrates to areas that might have fallen within a certain, to centres that might have fallen within a certain regional health authority area, but didn't fall within what the blood transfusion centre regarded as its geographical or territorial remit. And then we see at these regular meetings, or these annual meetings, attendance usually by somebody on behalf of University College Hospital. If we pick the picture up at the 1977 meeting, CBLA 40657, this is the meeting on the 23rd of September 1977. If we go to the second page, The list of attendees, the names about 15 or 20 names down, shows Dr. McVery, who obviously we've come across in relation to other haemophilia centres later, attending for Professor Prankard, representing University College Hospital. And if we go to the bottom of the next page, we look at the last few lines, it records Dr. McVery saying this: UCH needed 40 to 45 bottles NHS concentrate a month, as they now had 3 more patients on HT, home treatment. They were currently purchasing 20 to 25 bottles of Hemophilia a month to make good this shortfall. They wanted 20 to 25 extra bottles of NHS concentrate a month, and then there's a response from Dr. Dormandy, which says that the addresses of the patient should be taken into account in deciding whether Brentwood or Edgware should supply the extra needed. So we can see there in any event UCH reporting a shortfall in NHS concentrates, which they were making good through the purchase of commercial concentrates. That issue of shortfall was raised again at the annual meeting the following year of the same group of directors in September 1978. We don't need to go to it, but the reference for the transcript is CBLA 40838. Again, just looking at a snapshot as at the beginning of the 70s, if we go to DHSC 013026_014, we have, oh no, I'm sorry, that's the wrong reference. That's the reference again to St Mary's. I will try and find the correct reference for the transcript, but I will just tell you what the answers were from Professor Prankard. Sorry, Shomik, we can take that down. So the snapshot given by Professor Prankard was 29 cases registered at the centre. There'd been, in the year with which the request was concerned, 32 incidents of hemorrhage, 4 incidents of severe bleeding, 4 major surgical operations undertaken in patients registered with the centre. So that's the picture as at the beginning of the 1970s. If we then go to BPLL 308111, again, this is Dr. Maycock's questionnaire, and the UCH response is at page 30. So we can see the heading, top left of the page, Professor Prankard, University College Hospital. He responds as at late 1972, indicating that there are 8 patients with haemophilia regularly treated. And again, you can see his expressed preference for the treatment of patients is freeze-dried concentrate rather than cryo or a combination of cryo and concentrate. In terms of the number of patients treated at UCH in the 70s and 1980s, this information is drawn from the annual returns. I think the return for 1978 might be missing. But what the returns for that period indicate is usually a relatively small number of patients treated, between 3 and 12 haemophilia A patients, up to 4 patients with haemophilia B, up to 5 patients with von Willebrand's, in some years rather less. To get a sense of treatment policies, again, I'm afraid it's really only the annual returns that provide any kind of guide. If we look at the 1976 return at HCDO 301124, we've got the number of patients treated in that particular year, 12. We can see there that cryoprecipitate is the main product in use for treatment, but that as early as 1976, a range of different concentrates were being used. So we've got NHS concentrate, Highlands product, Hemophilia, Immunos product, cryopidin, all in use. although in relatively small numbers. There's, again, reasonably significant volume of cryoprecipitate used in 1977, approximately 105,000 units of cryoprecipitate, just under 68,000 units of NHS concentrate. But we then see, by 1979, a significant decline in the usage of cryoprecipitate. So if we go to the 1979 return at HCDO 0001381, we can see by now cryoprecipitate used only in the volume of 4,200 units. NHS concentrates use 60,000 units, and the product in greatest usage is the Highland product Hemophilia at 126,000 units. In 1980, again, the main forms of treatment are with NHS factor concentrates and with Highland, but there is the introduction of the immuno product, cryobilin, used in a very small amount in 1980. In 1981, there is again usage of cryoprecipitate, and the usage has crept up slightly to around 67,000 units. NHS factor concentrates are used, and the main commercial concentrate used in 1981 was cryobilin. And again, a similar pattern in 1982, some cryoprecipitate, but predominantly NHS factor 8 concentrates and cryobilin. If we then pick the picture up in 1983 at HCDO 301775, we can see here that in the course of 1983, we have 5 Haemophilia A patients treated, 1 Haemophilia A carrier, 8 von Willebrand's patients treated. And then no cryoprecipitate in use for Haemophilia A patients. It is used for the von Willebrand's patients. And then NHS concentrates in fairly substantial usage, 145,000 hospital, 125,000 odd home treatment. A small amount of the ARMA product now, 2,000 in hospital, and then immunos cryobilin, again, relatively substantial use, but not as much in that year as the NHS factor concentrates. And then, just to complete the picture, 1984 is at HCDO 301869. Told there 7 Haemophilia A patients treated, 1 carrier, and then 6 von Willebrand's patients. And then we can see there is some use of cryoprecipitate for Haemophilia A patients. The main product, however, in use is the NHS factor 8 concentrate for the Haemophilia A patients. There's a reference then towards the bottom in terms of the only commercial concentrate. There's reference to what's called cryoglobulin there, HT, presumably heat-treated, and reference to the use of DDAVP. Looks like that's for treatment of a carrier of Haemophilia A. And that, I think, is the first reference in the returns to DDAVP.
The use of cryo there, it's, what is it, about 50,000 units, roughly?
Yes, it's relatively substantial.
Yes, it's the NHS supplies, one way or the other, are hugely outnumber the commercial, and the commercial is heat-treated.
Yes. Whether that reflects a conscious decision by this point in time to try and avoid the use of unheated commercial concentrates, and therefore we see, for example, the usage of DDAVP, or whether, again, it reflects what happened to be available, I'm afraid we've no way of knowing. without the need to go to it, the correct reference for the letter from Professor Prankard from 1970, and this is just for the sake of the transcript, is DHSC 010026_016. Dr. Bolton-Maggs, in her statement, provided some insight into products used at UCH, where she first began work as a part-time registrar in 1980. She referred to DDAVP being introduced in preference to concentrate for mild haemophilia and mild von Willebrand's. She also refers to recalling the use of cryoprecipitate, but she doesn't recall the policy. In other words, she doesn't recall why particular products might be used for particular cohorts of patients. She says concentrates were introduced once they were available, and this policy was not decided by me. And as a part-time registrar at the time, no doubt that's correct. In terms of knowledge of risk of hepatitis or HIV, again, there's little by way of direct evidence. Professor Prankard was often represented by a clinical colleague at UKHCDO meetings. And we see, for example, a number of names, including Dr. Richards, who took over as director, or Dr. McVery attending from time to time, as well as others. And then once Dr. Richards took over as director, we see him attending various UKHCDO meetings in his own right as director, including in the early 1980s. Again, he didn't attend all of them and sent his apologies for some meetings, but it may be reasonable to assume he would have received the minutes of those meetings and have had some awareness of the discussions being undertaken. Dr. Bolton-Maggs has in her statement described her understanding of the nature and severity of different forms of hepatitis. She said in her statement, the impact of non-A, non-B hepatitis was not fully appreciated for some time, and that it became apparent that a number of patients with non-A, non-B hepatitis developed evidence of chronic liver damage. In relation to HIV, she said this: it was known before the virus was identified that the condition could be transmitted by blood transfusion, so it was not surprising to find evidence of immune dysfunction and illness in haemophilia patients in the early 1980s, before the virus was identified in 1983-4 and a test developed in 84-86. Understanding and knowledge of HIV and AIDS evolved as further research was published and information shared at the UKHCDO and other meetings. Dr. Bolton-Maggs was not able to provide us with details of what information might have been given to patients regarding the risks of hepatitis or HIV. And she couldn't recall whether, for example, cryoprecipitate was used as an alternative to concentrates in response to the risk of infection. In relation to the arrangements for testing for HIV, again, Dr. Bolton-Maggs has endeavoured to assist. She indicated in her statement that testing became available at UCH in around 1984 using Dr. Richard Tedder's laboratory. She could not remember herself the details of discussing AIDS with any patients, but again, that may be a reflection of the relatively junior position she held at the time. She did say that she thought at UCH patients would have been told their test results in person. She did not have any information about the numbers of infected patients at UCH. The data which the UKHCDO has provided to the inquiry suggests 5 patients positive for HIV, 1 patient identified as positive in 1982. That is presumably a reference to a retrospective testing of a stored sera sample from 1982, 1 in 1984, and 3 testing it positive in 1985. Insofar as hepatitis C is concerned, Dr. Bolton-Maggs believed that that would have become available in the early 1990s, but she, by that time, had moved to a different hospital and so was not able to cast any further light upon what the position was in terms of the arrangements for either testing or for the treatment of patients with hepatitis C at UCH. So that, Sarah, is the overview in relation to UCH. If I can move to the Hammersmith Hospital. There are a number of names which appear in documents relating to the Hammersmith in terms of clinicians. It would appear Professor Dacey, D-A-C-I-E, may have been director of the centre from around 1968 to 70. That Dr. Mibashan was director at Hammersmith from 1970 to 1976. He then moved to King's College. That Dr. Crawford may have been director, or at least have acted in that capacity in 1977. Dr. Hilgard, 78 to 9. Dr. Chipping, Dr. Patricia Chipping, is identified as the clinician on annual returns in 1970, 80 and 81, but she's provided the inquiry with a statement that says she was not the director of the Haemophilia Centre, and her role at the Hammersmith, she says, was as a registrar and senior registrar in haematology, and then a locum consultant in blood transfusion from 1980 to 1982. The statement we have from Dr. Chipping, I'll just give the reference, is WITN 4567001. We also have a statement from Dr. Howes, who's identified as the director of the centre 84 to 86 in the annual returns. And the reference for her statement is WITN 3779001. And then we have a statement from Dr. Michael Lefan, who took over as director of the Hammersmith Centre in 1992. And the reference for his statement is WITN 3089003. In terms of facilities at the Hammersmith Hospital, Dr. Chipping describes them as follows. Haemophilia patients at the Hammersmith were treated in a side room adjacent to the blood transfusion department. This was essentially for ease of access as blood products were stored in the blood transfusion department. The coagulation department was housed in a separate building in the Royal Postgraduate Medical School. Dr. Lefan is then able to describe the arrangements for haemophilia care in the second half of the 80s when he was a registrar. He says there was a treatment room, supplies of therapeutic products, staff of the haematology department. And then his statement relays a number of other changes to the way in which haemophilia care was delivered at the Hammersmith, culminating in there being a more structured approach in 1992. Again, the Hammersmith was one of the 13 designated haemophilia centres in the London area, as at 1970. It was part of the North West Thames region, so Region 5, and was supplied by the North London Blood Transfusion Centre in Edgware with blood and blood products. The 1976 allocation identifies 55 bottles per month as the allocation for Hammersmith Hospital of NHS Factor 8 concentrate. I'm not going to go back to the various minutes of the meetings of directors of haemophilia centres and associate centres and blood transfusion centres that we've now looked at on a number of occasions, which took place in 1976, 1977 and 1978. But the 1977 minutes record Dr. Bateman attending on behalf of the Hammersmith Hospital and reporting that there was a significant shortfall in NHS concentrate and that a large amount of commercial concentrate was being purchased for patients on home therapy and for use in hospital. And that's reported in the meeting on the 23rd of September 1977 at BART 40689. There is also some evidence to suggest that there may have been supplies of some products made available directly from BPL to the Hammersmith, but that may have been in relation to albumin rather than factor concentrates. The snapshot from the end of 1969, end of 1970, that is provided by the Hammersmith's response to Dr. Obank of the DHSS's letter is at, and I'm just going to read the transcript again, we don't need, read it for the transcript, we don't need to go to it, is at DHSC 013026_019. That indicates that there were 43 cases registered at the centre, 242 incidents of hemorrhage for which patients had attended the centre in the relevant year, 4 incidents of severe bleeding in patients attending the centre. If we go, however, to BPLL 308111, so this is the response to Dr. Maycock's questionnaire again. And I'm afraid I've failed to mark which page it is, so if you just give me a moment, I'll find the Hammersmith entry. Yes, it's page 24. So this is Dr. Mibashan's response. 30 patients treated with haemophilia regularly. What would you prefer to use for the treatment of your patients? Cryo, no. Freeze-dried concentrate, yes. Some cryo, some freeze-dried concentrate, no. And again, an estimate is given as to what would ideally be needed in terms of supply. In terms of the annual returns and numbers of patients treated, for the period 1976 to 1985, the returns suggest between about 28 patients and 36 patients with haemophilia A were treated on an annual basis, up to 8 von Willebrand's patients, between 1 and 5 haemophilia B patients, and in some years 1 or 2 carriers of haemophilia A. So not a huge centre, but a bigger centre than some of the other London centres that we've looked at. There is also evidence to suggest, both from Dr. Chipping, but perhaps more pertinently directly from patients who were treated at the hospital, that children as well as adults were treated at the Hammersmith Centre. The inquiries received a number of statements from individuals treated with blood products at the centre or from their families. We've referred to some of them in our presentation note, and you so have heard oral evidence from a number of them. I won't go through the details, but again, the themes that emerge are no advice or warnings or information about the risks of viral transmission from concentrates, a switch from cryoprecipitate to factor VIII concentrates, again, other main issues that emerge in terms of product usage. The annual returns, again, we'll just look at a handful of them, starting with 1976, HCDO 5088_002. We go to page 4. We can see in 1976, 36 haemophilia A patients treated, 5 haemophilia B patients treated. And then if we look at the products in use, cryoprecipitate used to a considerable extent, 392,000 units. Also NHS factor concentrates, 206,000 odd. But a range, albeit in smaller volumes, of commercial concentrates being used, coate, hemophil and cryoblin, all in use in 1976. 1977 likewise shows continuing significant use of cryoprecipitate. The figure from the annual returns is just under 418,000 units for cryo, but also NHS concentrate, coate and hemophil all being used, with hemophil being just under 200,000 units used in the course of 1977. 1978, also shows cryoprecipitate still being used in quite large measure, 338,000 odd units of cryoprecipitate used, but also Armour's product, Factor 8, used just under 350,000 units, and some NHS concentrates being used. 1979 again still shows cryoprecipitate in extensive use, but an increase in the usage of the Armour product, so over 500,000 units of Armour used in 1979, and approximately 325,000 units of cryoprecipitate, just over 100,000 units of NHS concentrates. If we then pick the picture up in 1980 at HCDO 301423, we see a different picture emerging. So 33 patients of haemophilia A treated that year, 5 milligrams. And then if we look at the figures, we can see very small amounts of cryoprecipitate in use, a reasonably significant volume of NHS concentrates being used, but by far and away the product in greatest use is the Armour product, Factor 8, over 700,000 units at hospital and just over 500,000 units for home treatment. Although the figure for cryoprecipitate goes up in 1981, Armour is still the product in greatest use in 1981. And then if we just go to 1982, and if I may, I'll complete the position in relation to the Hammersmith before we break. It's HCDO 301624. We can see there is a small amount of cryoprecipitate being used, just under 20,000. NHS concentrate being used. The Armour product, again, being used, and now cryobilin also in fairly extensive usage. And if we go to page 4, we see the entries per patient that you're very familiar with seeing now, and we can see from them that there isn't an obvious attempt to keep patients to one type of commercial concentrate. So a significant number of the patients are shown as receiving, for example, both the Armour product and the immuno product, and that pattern continues on the following page. So that is the picture for 1982. 1983 shows little cryoprecipitate, an increase in NHS concentrates, but again, the main product in use in 1983 is the Armour product. And the same picture emerges in relation to 1984. Dr. Chipping, in her statement, recalls supplies to the Hammersmith Hospital coming from the North London Blood Transfusion Centre, and she says that decisions about ordering were made on the basis of clinical need, but issue of product depended on their availability at the regional transfusion centre. And she said this: whilst we ordered British produced factor concentrates on the basis that we were aware the commercial products might contain plasma from paid donors, supplies of Factor 8 concentrate from BPL were limited, and until well into the 1980s, it was unusual to receive what we had ordered, substitution being made with commercial Factor 8, as supply was via the RTCs. She says, however, that financial considerations were not a factor in decision-making, so dictated, she suggests, to some extent by what was available. She doesn't recall DDAVP being available as an alternative treatment when she was at the Hammersmith Hospital, and she doesn't recall cryoprecipitate in routine use for the treatment of haemophilia A. Dr. Lefan's statement talks about the centre's treatment policy but that again is in the second half of the 1980s. And specifically in relation to the period from 1985 to 1987, he says patients were treated with non-concentrate therapies whenever possible and whenever it was judged safe from a hemostatic point of view. He talks also about a preference for UK concentrate when it was thought essential to use a concentrate to achieve hemostasis. In terms of knowledge of risk of hepatitis, response to risk, again, we're dependent largely upon attendance at meetings. Dr. Mibisham was a regular attender at UK HCDO meetings, or somebody attended from the Hammersmith on his behalf. We see, for example, also Dr. Chipping attending and others. Dr. Chipping has set out in her statement her general understanding in relation to hepatitis. Dr. Lefan has done likewise in his statement, picking up the picture from 1985 when he first started working at the Hammersmith. He says at that point in time the principal concern was the transmission of HIV. He says there were no additional measures taken at that point in time for hepatitis. In terms of testing, his recollection is by the time he joined Hammersmith Hospital in 1985, most patients had been tested and already knew the results of their test. He describes it being routine practice for the virology laboratory to retain stored samples of sera. Again, so you will wish to consider when you're looking at the Hammersmith, the evidence you've heard from individuals who were treated there. You've heard accounts of patients not being told that they were being tested for HIV or indeed for hepatitis B, and having certainly no concerns about the way in which HIV test results were communicated. The information that we have from UK HCDO as to the numbers of patients infected with HIV at the Hammersmith Hospital Hemophilia Centre it suggests 26 patients, which obviously is a fairly high proportion of the number of patients who were treated. In terms of hepatitis C, Dr. Lefan's statement suggests that 64 patients at the centre were found to have evidence of hepatitis C infection. His recollection is that testing at the Hammersmith for hepatitis C began before 1992, and he says he would tell patients usually in clinic, and it wasn't the policy, to inform patients by phone or by letter. And he says this, he tried to ensure that all patients who'd received blood or blood products were tested for hepatitis C antibodies. However, it became possible to test for hepatitis C virus later it became possible to test for hepatitis C virus by PCR, and this was also done. However, this was not done systematically. A systematic review to ensure that all patients who received any blood products were tested was carried out in 2010 and followed up in 2017 under direction of UK HCDO. And again, both Dr. Lefan's statement and some of the evidence that you've received from witnesses provides, in broad terms, a description of the treatment arrangements for hepatitis and for HIV at the Hammersmith. Dr. Lefan said he would refer patients with evidence of hepatitis C infection to the hepatology department for management, and that by the time he was director in 1992, patients with HIV infection were referred to a dedicated HIV clinic. So that's the position then, again, by way of overview and highlight of the documentation we have available relating to the Hammersmith Hospital, and that's probably a good point to break.
Yes, well, we'll take a break now until 10 to 4. 10 to 4.